The rain had stopped hours ago, yet the earth still smelled of storm. The clouds hung low, brushing the tops of the pine trees, and somewhere far off a train moaned through the fog like a wounded animal. I stood on the cracked porch of the old house that used to belong to my parents, watching the mist roll over the fields. My name is Michael Turner, and after 20 years of service in places most people can't find on a map, I came home to nothing. The house was small, half forgotten by time. The paint had peeled, the windows fogged, and the roof sagged like the shoulders of an old soldier. But it was home, or at least what was left of it. When I opened the door, the smell of dust and wood rot filled the air. I set down my single duffel bag and listened to the silence. It was heavy, unfamiliar. I had spent years listening to radios, gunfire, and the heartbeat of danger. Silence felt like a stranger. I sat by the window that first night, watching the rain trace crooked lines on the glass. The clock ticked too loud. Every sound in that empty house seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind, even the faint beat of my own pulse. I thought about the men I'd left behind, the ones who didn't get to come home. Their faces blurred together, some smiling, some screaming. In the darkness, they all looked the same. Sleep didn't come easily. It hadn't for years. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back in those deserts, in those cities torn apart by fire and fear. I could smell the sand, the oil, the blood. I'd wake with my heart racing, drenched in sweat, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. But the house was still. The only weapon left to me now was memory, and it was the heaviest one of all. Days turned into weeks. I fixed the fence, patched the roof, mended what I could. The village was small, 20 houses, maybe less. People lived quietly here, far from the noise of the world. They recognized me, some even remembered my parents, but few came close. I had that look, the one soldiers carry when they've seen too much. The first to break the silence was old Mr. Harrison, who lived across the field. He was 70, maybe more, with a white beard and a limp that made every step look like an effort. One morning he appeared at my gate with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that time hadn't managed to erase. "You're Michael Turner, right?" he asked. I nodded. "Your father used to fix my tractor. Guess it's your turn now." He laughed. I didn't, but I helped him anyway. He started coming by every few days, bringing stories about the village, gossip about people I'd never met. I listened not because I cared much, but because his voice filled the silence. Over time I realized I needed that. There was a small river behind my property. Some afternoons I'd sit there, fishing rod in hand, though I rarely caught anything. It wasn't about the fish. It was about sitting still. About hearing something other than the echoes of the past. The water moved slow, reflecting the sky, and sometimes I thought that if I stared long enough, I'd see the man I used to be. But he never appeared. Then came winter, the kind that strips the world of color. The days were short, the nights endless. I chopped wood, repaired tools, cooked what little I could. The radio played softly in the evenings, old songs that once belonged to another life. The loneliness pressed harder then. There were moments I thought of leaving, disappearing somewhere new. But I had no energy left for running. One morning the snow fell so thick I could barely see the fence. I went outside to clear the path and heard someone calling for help. A woman's voice. I followed the sound and found her. Her car had slid off the narrow road, half buried in the ditch. She was trying to push it free, her boots sinking in the snow. "Let me," I said, grabbing the bumper. Together we rocked it until the tires caught traction. The car lurched back onto the road. She laughed, nervous, grateful. "Thank you," she said, brushing the snow from her coat. "You must be Mr. Turner. The locals told me about you. The mysterious man who lives by the river." Her name was Laura Bennett, the new teacher at the village school. She was 30, maybe younger, with kind gray eyes and the calm strength of someone who had already survived something painful. She'd come from the city after a divorce, looking for peace, or maybe a second chance. That evening she brought a basket of bread and jam to thank me. I tried to refuse, but she insisted. "It's the least I can do," she said. We sat by the fire drinking tea, talking about nothing and everything: the weather, the village, the strange quiet of rural life. I found myself listening more than speaking. Her voice had warmth. It made the walls feel closer, the world smaller, gentler. Days passed and somehow she kept finding reasons to stop by. Once it was a leaky faucet, then a broken window. I fixed them all, though half the time they didn't need fixing. I realized she wasn't just looking for help. She was reaching out. And maybe in some quiet corner of my heart, I was reaching back. We started walking together on Sundays, following the frozen path along the river. She'd talk about her students, the challenges of teaching children who had never seen the world beyond these hills. I'd listen, and sometimes when she asked about my past, I'd tell her a little. Not much, just enough to let her know I had been somewhere far away. At night, alone again, I'd think about her smile, the way her scarf fluttered in the wind, the way her eyes lingered on mine when she laughed. It scared me, because peace had always been dangerous to me. When things got quiet, something always broke the silence. One evening she invited me to dinner. Her house was small but warm, filled with books, the faint scent of cinnamon, and the soft hum of a record player. We ate simple food, soup and bread, and talked for hours. I felt something shift inside me, something I thought had died long ago. Hope. When I walked her home that night, the sky was heavy with snow. She looked at me and said softly, "You don't talk much, do you?" I smiled faintly. "I used to talk a lot," I said. "Then life taught me to listen." She nodded, as if she understood everything I didn't say. That night I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window again, watching the snow fall over the silent village. For the first time in years I didn't feel haunted. I felt alive. But peace, I would learn, has a cruel sense of humor. Because just as I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could build a life again, the past found a way to call me back. And it started, as it always did, with a ringing phone. The days grew shorter, and the snow piled higher. The world outside turned white and still, like a photograph that refused to move. In that frozen quiet, something fragile began to grow. Something that neither Laura nor I dared to name. Every morning I'd see her walking to the school, her scarf trailing behind her like a soft flame in the cold air. Sometimes I'd offer to drive her, but she always refused with a smile. "I like the walk," she'd say. "It makes me feel alive." There was something about her voice, gentle but certain, that reminded me of the people I used to fight for. The ones who still believed the world could be kind. She began leaving small things at my door. A jar of honey, a book, a note scribbled in her careful handwriting. At first, I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't used to kindness. In the places I came from, gifts always came with strings. But these didn't. They were small gestures, warm and human. And for the first time in years, I wanted to deserve them. One afternoon, she invited me to the school's winter festival. The children had built snowmen, decorated the yard with paper lanterns, and filled the air with laughter. I stood among them, awkward and unsure, watching as Laura helped a small boy fix a broken lantern. The way she knelt beside him, patient and smiling, made something ache inside me. It wasn't pain exactly, it was memory of what it felt like to belong somewhere. Later, she introduced me to the other teachers. They spoke politely, curious about the quiet man who never seemed to leave his house. I could feel their questions hanging in the air, unasked but understood. Laura didn't explain me. She didn't need to. She simply smiled and said, "He's a friend." Somehow that word meant more than any rank or title I'd ever held. As weeks passed, we began sharing dinners more often. Sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. The conversations deepened. She told me about her past. A marriage that had fallen apart under the weight of silence and unspoken pain. She had left the city because she couldn't breathe there anymore. "Out here," she said, "the silence doesn't hurt. It heals. I wanted to tell her that silence could also destroy, that I had lived in it for years, trapped inside the echo of things I couldn't forget. But instead, I just nodded and poured her another cup of tea. There was one night I'll never forget. The power went out during a snowstorm, and she came to my house with candles in her hands. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls. We sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, the flicker of light dancing across her face. She asked me about the places I'd been. I told her a few stories, nothing too dark, nothing too real. But then she looked at me and said softly, "You don't have to protect me from your truth, Michael." For a long moment I said nothing. Then the words came, slow and heavy. I told her about the last mission, the one that ended everything. A rescue gone wrong. A friend who didn't make it. The explosion, the screams, the orders that shouldn't have been given. When I finished, the silence between us was thick. I couldn't look at her. But she didn't turn away. Instead, she reached across the space between us and took my hand. "You came home," she whispered. "That means something." No one had ever said that to me before. From that night, something shifted. We didn't speak about love, not yet, but it was there. In the way she lingered by the door when leaving, in the way I started counting the hours until she'd return. The winter deepened, and so did we. I began to laugh again, quietly, awkwardly at first. The sound startled even me. Laura would smile when she heard it, as if every laugh was a victory. One evening, we walked down to the frozen river. The moon was bright, the snow sparkling like broken glass. She stopped suddenly and turned to me. "Do you ever think about leaving again?" she asked. I hesitated. "Sometimes. But not the same way I used to." "What changed?" "You," I said simply. She looked away, her cheeks flushed from the cold, or maybe from my words. When we reached the bridge, she slipped on the ice. I caught her before she fell. For a second, she was in my arms, her face close to mine, her breath visible in the cold air. I could feel her heartbeat. The world went still. Then she laughed, breaking the spell. "You always show up right on time." I smiled faintly. "It's what I do." But inside I was terrified, because I knew how stories like mine ended. Every time I reached for something good, something pure, it was taken. And part of me believed I didn't deserve peace. Still, I couldn't stop seeing her. We spent Christmas together. She decorated a small tree with handmade ornaments, humming softly while I watched. The fire crackled, the snow whispered outside. And for the first time since I could remember, I felt safe. When midnight came, she handed me a small box. Inside was a silver compass. "So you never lose your way again," she said. I didn't realize then how cruelly prophetic those words would become, because the next morning the phone rang. It was a number I hadn't seen in years, the kind of number that doesn't belong to ordinary people. I stared at it for a long time, the screen glowing like an open wound. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, familiar. "Turner, we need you." I said nothing. My pulse quickened. "It's a cleanup," the voice continued. "Eastern sector. Unfinished business. You're the only one who can handle it." "I'm done," I said. There was a pause. "It's not about you. It's about them." The line went dead. I stood there, staring at the silent phone, the snow still falling outside. Later that evening, Laura stopped by. She noticed my expression immediately. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing," I lied. "Just an old call." She didn't press. But she knew. There was something in her eyes, a quiet fear, an intuition that the peace we'd built was about to shatter. That night, I sat by the river again, the compass in my hand, the metal cold against my skin. I thought about the men I'd lost, the promises I'd broken, and the life I was finally beginning to rebuild. Could I walk away again? Leave her behind for ghosts that refused to die? The snow kept falling, erasing my footprints one by one. By morning, it was as if I'd never been there at all. The sound of that phone call didn't fade. It stayed with me, like the echo of a shot that never ends. For days I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it meant nothing. But old instincts never die quietly. They wait. They whisper. Every morning I'd wake before dawn, heart pounding, eyes searching the darkness for enemies that weren't there. Laura would still be asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I envied her peace. For her the night was rest. For me it was memory. I tried to keep busy. I fixed the gate, chopped wood, cleaned the shed. But the rhythm of normal life began to feel unnatural, like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Every sound, the bark of a dog, the creak of the floor, brought me back to another place. The war inside me had never ended. It had only gone silent, waiting for permission to return. A week later, I found a letter in my mailbox. No name, no return address, just a symbol on the envelope. I recognized it instantly. The same mark used by the organization I had once worked for years ago, in the shadows of governments and forgotten conflicts. Inside there was a single page. Coordinates. A date. A short message. You are still one of us. I burned the paper, but the words had already taken root. That night I sat outside under the stars. The air was sharp, the sky endless. Laura joined me, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Somehow she already knew that I was slipping away from her. Inch by inch, thought by thought. Sometimes, she said softly, the past doesn't ask for permission to come back. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because deep down I already knew I was going. The next morning I found myself at the edge of town, watching the horizon as if it held the answers. My hands trembled, not from fear but from recognition. The part of me that had been asleep for years was awake again, hungry for purpose. But there was something different this time, something human that hadn't been there before. Her. Laura came to see me that evening. She brought food, pretending it was just another visit. We sat in silence, the way people do when words are too fragile. She looked around the room, the bags half-packed, the maps, the restless air. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. When? Soon. She nodded slowly, her eyes wet but steady. Will you come back? I wanted to promise her. I wanted to lie. But lies are luxuries for men who believe in safety. I had never been one of them. Instead, I said, I'll try. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, every object a memory, her laughter in the kitchen, her handwriting on the fridge, the scent of her scarf on the chair. It all felt like a life borrowed from someone else. A life I was about to return. At dawn I left. No note. No goodbye. I thought it would be easier that way. The train carried me through a blur of frozen fields and sleeping towns. I watched my reflection in the window. A stranger staring back. The man I used to be. The man I thought I'd buried. The rendezvous point was a deserted airfield. A black SUV waited near the hangar. When I approached, the door opened. A man stepped out, older, thinner, but unmistakable. Cole. My former commander. He smiled without warmth. I knew you couldn't ignore the call. I said nothing. We lost a team 3 weeks ago, he continued. Hostages. Civilian contractors. We need extraction. Clean. No mistakes. I'm not a soldier anymore. He shrugged. You never stop being one. You just forget for a while. I looked at the folder he handed me. Photos. Coordinates. Faces. One of them was a young woman, maybe 20. Eyes full of fear. Something twisted in my chest. This isn't my fight, I said quietly. Cole stepped closer. It's everyone's fight when they come for your people. I should have walked away. I almost did. But the ghosts inside me had already decided. That night, I boarded a small plane under a false name. As the engines roared to life, I thought of Laura. Of her voice. Her hands. The warmth I was leaving behind for the cold certainty of duty. For the next 10 days I disappeared. No messages. No trace. The world forgot me as it always did when I left it behind. The mission was chaos disguised as order. The target was deep in hostile territory, an abandoned factory on the edge of a war zone. The plan was simple on paper, impossible in practice. We moved at night through mud and ruins, the smell of smoke thick in the air. Every step was a memory. Every sound was a trigger. I felt alive again and I hated it. On the 5th night we found the hostages. 3 of them. Starved, beaten, terrified. But alive. We extracted them under fire. I don't remember the gunshots. I remember the eyes of the girl in the photo, the same fear, the same fragile hope. When it was over, the team celebrated. I didn't. Because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't coming back the same. We flew home under fake skies, our names erased. Cole shook my hand at the airstrip. You did good, Turner. Go home. Rest. Home. The word felt foreign. When I returned, the house was silent. Laura's car was gone. The air smelled of dust and distance. On the kitchen table was a note. It read. I waited. I tried to understand. But love can't live in silence. If you ever come back, not from war but truly back, find me. I sat down and read it again. And again. Until the words blurred. Outside, the snow began to fall. The same snow that once covered our laughter, our footprints, our promises. The compass she gave me lay on the table, its needle trembling, pointing nowhere. That night I realized something brutal and beautiful. Peace was never a place. It was a person. And I had left her behind. The war was over again. But this time there were no medals, no speeches, no flags. Only silence. The kind that lives inside a man when everything he was built upon finally collapses. The train back home felt slower than before, as if the world itself resisted my return. I watched the landscapes blur by. Villages, rivers, forests still heavy with snow. None of it looked familiar anymore. Perhaps it was me who had changed, not the view. When I stepped off at the small station, no one was waiting. The wind cut through my coat, carrying the faint smell of pine and smoke. The same air I had once called peace now felt like exile. I walked to the house. The key turned easily, the door creaked the way it always had. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except it wasn't. The silence was different now. It wasn't empty, it was accusing. The chair where Laura used to sit, the mug she always used, the book she never finished. All of it was there, frozen in time. I stood in the middle of the room, listening to nothing. And in that nothing I heard her voice. Not the words, just the echo. If you ever come back, truly come back, find me. I read her note again. The paper soft from how many times my hands had folded it. The ink had faded a little, but the message was still sharp enough to cut. Days passed. I tried to live, to breathe, to work. But life refused to start again. I would wake before sunrise, walk down to the river, and stand there until the cold burned my lungs. The compass hung around my neck, its needle trembling uselessly. Sometimes I imagined I could still see her walking along the path, scarf fluttering, smiling at something unseen. But it was just memory pretending to be hope. I didn't know where she'd gone. The city, maybe. Somewhere she could disappear. Somewhere she could forget. I told myself she was happier there, that leaving was the only way she could survive me. But every night, that lie grew heavier. The mind of a soldier is trained to endure pain, but it's never trained to live without purpose. Without love. I started writing again. Not letters to her, not reports, just words. Fragments of thoughts, regrets, moments. Pages filled with what I could never say aloud. First it felt pointless. Then it felt necessary. Then it became the only thing keeping me from breaking. In those writings I confessed everything, not just to her but to myself. The missions. The men I'd lost. The guilt of surviving when better men hadn't. And beneath it all, one truth. I didn't know how to live in peace because I'd never learned how. One morning I woke to find the snow melting. Spring had come quietly without asking permission. The trees were still bare, but there was promise in the air. The kind that hurts and heals at the same time. I packed a small bag. Inside it, her note, the compass, and one of the letters I'd written, the only one that began with her name. I took the first bus to the city. The road wound through hills and fading winter light. Every mile felt like a confession. The city was louder than I remembered. Too many people, too many lights, too many ghosts. I didn't know where to start. So I just walked through streets and parks past faces that meant nothing. Until I saw her. It was almost by accident. She was sitting outside a cafe reading, a scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Time hadn't changed her much. Maybe softer, maybe sadder. She looked up as if sensing me, and for a moment our eyes met. The world stopped. I didn't move. Neither did she. And then slowly she closed her book, stood, and walked away. Not fast. Not angry. Just distant. I followed. Not to chase her, not to demand, just to understand. She turned into a small park, where children were playing near the fountain. When she finally stopped, she looked back. Her gaze was calm, tired, knowing. And in that look, I understood everything she didn't need to say. She had moved on. She had survived me. I wanted to speak, to explain, but the words refused to come. Because explanations are for the living. And part of me was still buried out there where the war had ended. She gave me a small, almost invisible nod. Not of forgiveness, not of rejection. Just acceptance. Then she walked away, disappearing into the noise of life. I sat on a bench until the sun set. Around me people laughed, cars honked, life continued. But for me everything was still. When night came I took out the compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find north. I laughed quietly. It figured. Back at the small motel, I opened the letter I had written for her. I didn't send it. I simply read it one last time. Laura, you once told me silence could heal. You were right. But you forgot to say that it also remembers. Every quiet night, every breath, every heartbeat, they all carry your name. I went to war to protect strangers. But you were the only one who ever tried to save me. If someday you look at the sky and feel something missing, it's not the stars. It's me. Somewhere between duty and peace, still learning how to live. Thank you for teaching me what home feels like. Michael. I folded it, placed it inside the compass box, and left it on the nightstand. Then I lay down, closed my eyes, and listened to the hum of the city. For the first time, I didn't dream of war. I dreamed of her, walking across a quiet field, smiling. The next morning, I took the bus back to the village. I didn't expect anything waiting for me there, and nothing was. The house was still, but no longer hostile. Just quiet. I opened the window. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. I sat at the table, pen in hand, and began to write again. Not about war, not about loss, but about her. About peace. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't closure. But it was something close enough to both. And sometimes that's all a man like me can hope for. The morning came softly. No drums, no thunder, no orders. Just light, pale, fragile, breaking through the fog like a whisper saying, "It's time." I sat by the window, the same one I'd once watched her leave through. The world outside was still wet from last night's rain. Drops clung to the glass like small memories refusing to fall. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight in my chest. The silence that used to suffocate me now felt gentle. Like a blanket. Like forgiveness. Maybe peace doesn't arrive with fireworks. Maybe it's something quieter. Something you only notice when you stop fighting. I made coffee. The smell filled the kitchen, and it almost felt like her laughter again. I caught myself smiling. Not at what was lost, but at what had been. The house no longer felt empty. It felt lived in. Felt human again. I spent that day cleaning, fixing things I'd ignored for years. The squeaking door, the loose shelves, the broken fence outside. Each nail, Each brush of dust felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. At noon, I walked to the old field near the river. The grass had grown tall. Wildflowers had taken over the paths. The wind carried the sound of distant bells. I sat under the oak tree, the one we used to sit beneath in summer, and took out the compass. The needle trembled, then slowly found north. I laughed softly. "About time," I said aloud. I realized then it was never broken. It just needed stillness to remember where to point. Maybe that's what I'd needed too. A small boy passed by, running with a wooden plane in his hands. He stumbled, fell, then looked up at me. I helped him to his feet, brushed off his knees. "Thanks," he said, grinning. His mother called him from a distance. He waved and ran back. For a moment I stood watching the boy, the sunlight, the life that keeps going no matter who stays or leaves. I whispered, "You were right, Laura. The world does move on." When I returned home, I opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote a single line. "This is where life begins again." Then I started writing, not about war or loss, but about the quiet things. The way morning light touches old wood. The sound of rain on tin. The warmth of a stranger's smile. The miracle of simply being here. Every page felt lighter. Every word. A breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Weeks turned into months. I started teaching writing classes at the local school. At first, the children were shy. They thought soldiers couldn't write about love. But they learned quickly that even silence has a story. Sometimes I would catch myself glancing at the horizon, wondering where she was now, whether she was happy. And every time I smiled because I finally understood. Love isn't something you lose. It's something you carry differently. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, I walked to the cemetery. There was a small memorial there for those who never came back. I placed a single wildflower on the stone marked unknown. "For all of us," I whispered. "For everything we couldn't say." The wind rose, warm and soft. It didn't sound like sorrow anymore. It sounded like release. As I turned to leave, I saw a small envelope tucked under a nearby stone. My name on it, in handwriting I'd never forget. I froze. My heart didn't race this time. Simply listened. I opened it carefully. "Michael, if you're reading this, it means you finally came back, truly back. I didn't wait for you, but I never forgot you. You were the chapter one could never close, no matter how many pages life turned. I hope you found peace. I hope you found yourself. Somewhere out there, between the noise and the quiet, I'll be wishing you the same sunrise. L." I stood there, holding the letter as the last light faded. It didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like a blessing. When I walked home that night, the stars were out, clear, endless, alive. I looked up and whispered, "Thank you." Inside, I placed her letter next to the compass on the table. Then I blew out the lamp and sat in the dark. But this darkness was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. Full of every heartbeat, every silence, every memory that had shaped me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a soldier. I felt like a man who had finally learned how to live. The next morning, I woke before dawn, opened the door and stepped outside. The horizon was glowing gold. The birds were singing. The world was waiting. I took a deep breath. Not as a survivor, not as a ghost, but simply as someone alive. And as the sun rose over the field, I whispered to the wind, "Mission complete."